Hi everyone, welcome to Beyond the Script, where we study movies and TV shows to discover what goes into great storytelling. In the previous video, I mentioned the topic of magic system, which inspired me to talk about world building, since it's one of my favorite aspects of storytelling. So let's just start off this video by talking about what world building is. When I was researching for this video, I figured a lot of online sources describe world building as constructing the setting of your story. And personally, I think this is a horrible approach to world building. I think there is a huge difference between a world and a setting, and that's mostly what I want to talk about in this video. Setting can be described as the time and the place in which a story is told. Setting is essential for creating movies or TV shows because it's the foundation of visual storytelling and helps engage the audience. And it can also be used to add another layer of realism to stories and bring them to life. For example, in a period movie, setting obviously plays a huge part because it's the very thing that inspired the story to be told in the first place. But beyond that, it doesn't really contribute more to a story. On the other hand, world building is more than just a setting. When it comes to world building, you don't think of your environment as the where of the story. You think of it as a supporting character. Good world building requires interaction between characters and their environment. And when I say interaction, I'm not talking about problem solving. It's not about how they use their surroundings to solve problems. It's deeper than that. In a story that has a good world building, the environment of the story is the environment that the story is being told inside is alive. It's not just there to be there, it's there to teach the protagonist a lesson so that the protagonist can complete his hero's journey and hopefully save the day. The way I see it, there are two types of world building in stories. Type A is when a protagonist is introduced to a new world and needs to learn how to interact with it, and in the process they learn a crucial lesson that helps them change. Or type B is when a character is born and grew up in a specific world and then they realize that change is required, so they need to change their own outlook so they can change the environment around them. So to sum up, in type A, the protagonists learn that they are the ones that need to change and live in harmony with the environment. And then in type B, the protagonists change because they realize in order to change the environment, first they require to change themselves. Most of the stories in sci-fi fantasy are type A. You have a group of travelers who are introduced to an alien planet that really pushes them to their limits, so characters are put into a situation where they require to change and adapt for the purpose of survival, and in the process they discover the true essence of their character and change for the worse or better. Good examples of this are Avatar, Dune, or Prometheus. The stories are very straightforward. There is a new planet or a new world, new environment. You need to change. You need to survive. You need to change, and then you change, and then the story progresses as you do. Now, in all the examples I have mentioned here, the world is nature. It's an ecosystem, and we are unfamiliar with this new ecosystem, and we are bound to interrupt the harmony of the world, and therefore our characters end up encountering conflict, and then they get punished for it. After the punishment takes place, they learn that they need to study the ecosystem so they can live in harmony with it, and it is in this process that they learn and advance. Creating a well-balanced ecosystem is a significant part of a storytelling in stories that have type A world building. So make sure your world has harmony, and to do this you need to create an ecosystem where different species interact with one another. To do this, you can draw inspiration from nature documentaries or other great stories such as Scavenger Rain. Scavenger Rain is an animated series and has one of the most innovative and complex ecosystems that I've ever seen in a story, so make sure to check it out. I know it's not very popular, but it's an amazing show. So if you're interested, make sure to check that out. And then, as I said previously, in world building, you need to think of your setting as a character, and a character needs personalities, specifically personalities that the protagonist needs to observe and learn from. For example, in Dune, the planet can be described as unforgiving, harsh, and barren. And Paul is a prince with a lot of potential, but he was born in luxury. So to reach his full potential, he needs to learn how to survive in a harsh environment where there are no rooms for making mistakes. Also, the planet being a barren land is a very important part of his personality. The lack of water in this environment is what inspired its ecosystem, as well as the people who inhabit the planet. So in order for us to understand the characters, we really need to understand the world they're living in, and that requires the world to have personalities and to have to be its own character, basically. And that's how we discover why free men are so rough around the edges and good at survival, which is what Paul needs to learn in order to transition into the Messiah everyone think he is. It's a similar kind of thing with Avatar. The word in Avatar is a word of empathy, where aliens, or just the alien species that we encounter, the blue people, have learned how to live in harmony with the ecosystem rather than trying to rise above it. And this teaches Jake about empathy, love, and respect for every form of life, which are the lessons he needs to learn to start respecting the planet and becoming a good leader. But you don't necessarily need to limit yourself to nature to tell a great story. Maybe you are from a big city like New York or Toronto and you don't know much about nature. Then you can go in a different direction and tell your story in a city. An example of this is Altered Carbon, which is my favorite TV show of all time, and it's all because of its great world building. Also, the season 1 is the greatest show of all time. Season 2 was just horrible. However, keep in mind that most of the stories that are told in cities fall under type B world building, and most of them are bound to be dystopias. Stories like Daredevil, the Batman 2022, Brave New World, these are all just, they basically leverage type B world building. A funny thing about the stories that are told in cities are how cities are a cancer for civilization. The theme of these stories is usually how the human spirit deserves better than living in a corrupt city, and how we can help improve the city for better. Now you can definitely go ahead and tell a different story, and I actually encourage you to do so because it would be very new and something we haven't seen before. But deep down, I think humans know that they are not meant to live in cities. Now, this is not a philosophy channel, so we're not going to talk about that, and we're going to move on. In what I call type B world building, the story very quickly establishes who the protagonist is and what are their ideologies. We see this in Daredevil and Altered Carbon. Very early on in the story, we see how they reveal their ideologies on different topics and how they want to protect the victims of the city and hopefully be able to improve on the quality of life of the people who live in the city. In the first episode of Daredevil, he rescues women who are about to be sold, and he quickly goes on to save a kid who gets kidnapped. And in Altered Carbon, we see how Takashi empathizes with prostitutes who are being abused and don't approve of the way that MEFs live their life, which is just it just doesn't have any consequences. So, yeah. We can also get to see the opposite outlook that antagonists have on life and how corrupt they really are. And in type B, world building is mostly comes down to that. It's just basically crashes of two ideologies and who gets to win at the end. It's basically an idea of like good versus evil. Now, the world plays a huge part in these stories because it is what creates the protagonist and the antagonist in the first place. Cities are harsh environments, and the corruption leads to unfortunate events that leads our characters to choose a specific path in life that is detrimental to the storytelling. For example, Bruce Wayne becomes Batman after losing his parents and wanting to get revenge from the criminals in the city. And then Daredevil loses his fathers to the corruption in the same way and doesn't want to sit back and watch as everyone else to suffer. In the same process, the city also creates villains, people who can't take the abuse anymore. Therefore, they snap and become the very thing that they hated because that's the only way they know how to survive in the environment. We see this with Riddler or Wilson Fisk or Joker in modern movies. Now, in very good stories that leverage type B world building, the writer oftentimes doesn't define morality for the audience and leaves it up to them to define good or bad. And this is something that's been very new, I think. We see this in Joker, where the story creates such a complicated narrative that doesn't establish Joker as a villain but a victim, and gets the audience to empathize with an individual with mental illness who ends up committing heinous acts as a way to cope with his environment and as a mean of survival. I think this story is doing an amazing job of defining what it means to be human and how life is more complicated than it actually looks. We can't just reduce a person to the choices that they make, but why they made those choices in the first place and how we can improve on our quality of life as a species and improve the state of civilization. And then that's mostly what that's mostly what world building is in both types that I talked about. We see this kind of similar. I mean, that's what a story is. A story is basically has a theme that tell us how to live our life. If you're a very smart writer, you're able to basically leverage your own life experiences to communicate that lesson with the audience. Now, as humans, obviously, the place we're living in is very detrimental to our mental health as well as just the way we live our life. And a good world building comes down to that. It's just how we interact with the environment around us and what that says about us, and how our ideologies basically change the environment too. And if you want to write a very good story, you need to understand not just the people that or the characters that you're writing about. I mean, it depends basically on what you're writing, but if you are passionate about world building, you also have to think about, oh, how as a character, how is my environment going to interact with my character, or my protagonist or my antagonist, and all these different things. Now, that's it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for listening. Obviously, everything I talk about in this channel is based on my own understanding of a storytelling, and it's not bound to be right. So if you think there is more to world building, please leave a comment. I would love to further explore this topic. And there is so much you can do with world building. There are so many different elements you can mess around with. So feel free to create weird stuff, but make sure at the end of the day that your characters are learning from the environment you're building. And that's how you can take your settings to a whole nother level. And I know I already talked about the setting a little bit. If you're a filmmaker, setting is very important, obviously. Setting is the thing that engages your audience. In a movie, the setting doesn't necessarily have to be a word. It doesn't necessarily have to have a personality. I mean, the visual storytelling obviously has a personality of its own, but the characters don't necessarily have to interact, because just because you're making a film, it's not a requirement to do world building. Sometimes the story you want to tell you just need the characters to tell it, and that's totally fine too. But I'm just saying, if you really care about creating a world, then it's better to go about it like this, to just not think of it as the setting, but a character that the main characters are interacting with and learning from, and try to use that to your leverage to better explain your characters. And that's it for today. Thank you so much.